Well, good afternoon, everybody. Good morning and good evening, wherever you are in the world. We have a sizable audience with us today. We're just waiting for a few more people to join. And my colleagues at FlightGlobal will be helping with any questions if anybody's finding it difficult to log on, etc. But we'll get going, everybody. Welcome to all of you to FlightGlobal's latest in our series of 4 webinars focusing on the crucial topic of aviation sustainability. My name is Mark Pilling, and I'm a consulting editor at FlightGlobal. Now, we're partnering on this webinar with Pratt and Whitney, one of the industry's giants when it comes to delivering the engine technology that powers the world airliner fleet. And I'm sure, as Sean Bradshaw from Pratt and Whitney would tell us, it's a company deeply committed to ensuring that future power plants are as sustainable as possible. Now, we welcome questions from our audience, so please post them on the Q&A icon at the bottom, and we'll try and answer, as many of those as we can. Now to the action, and I'm really delighted to welcome 4 experts to discuss SAF in today's webinar, and are all deep into aviation sustainability. We've got Sean Bradshaw, who's a fellow sustainable propulsion at Pratt and Whitney. We've got Sean Newsom, he's a director of environmental strategy at Boeing commercial airplanes. We've got Andrea Moyes, the aviation global sustainability director at BP, and the man with the longest title, Stephen Barrett, the associate department head, aeronautics and astronautics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be taking stock of SAF. And in what, in perhaps a year, maybe 18 months, SAF, Sustainable Aviation Fuel, has become another handy industry acronym. We all use it as shorthand for solving aviation's greenhouse gas emissions problem, don't we? In its Clean Skies for Tomorrow report in November 2020, the World Economic Forum said, stakeholders across the aviation fuel value chain agree that SAF is a critical component in the industry's pathway to decarbonisation. And today we're going to take stock of SAF. We're going to ask how far SAF has come. Is it the cure for emissions reduction? And more importantly, how far does it have to go on the pathway to decarbonisation? We're going to check in on the technical development of SAF. What else needs to be done? We're going to examine the barriers to ramping up SAF production. We're going to debate what comes after SAF or in parallel with SAF, talking about e-fuels and hydrogen fuels. And we're going to examine the non-CO2 impact of aviation to climate change, the elegant contrail. Why aren't we talking about these more? So with that, let's get to it, and let's keep the questions coming. I can see there's some already coming in. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists as a sort of an introduction to get us going, to hear their voices in the room. And I'm going to start with Sean Bradshaw. I'm going to ask you, Sean, in under a minute, if you like, give us your stock take on SAF progress.
Well, Mark, first, thank you very much for that introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all around the world. Look, at Pratt & Whitney, we view sustainable aviation fuels as absolutely critical for our industry to meet its commitments to net zero CO2 by 2050 and to reducing our overall environmental footprint to near zero by 2050 as well. That's important. Today, sustainable aviation fuels may provide up to an 80% reduction in net CO2 emissions on a carbon life cycle basis, depending on technology pathway and feedstock. And sustainable aviation fuel blends up to 50% are approved by ASTM for all commercial use as well. So we view sustainable aviation fuels, particularly the ASTM blends, as the best pathway for reducing the industry's aviation CO2 footprint now, particularly in our legacy fleet and in current modern engines, as SAF production increases from its current levels of under 0.01% of global jet fuel demand to something like 10%, consistent with the White House's Grand SAF strategy by 2030, and hopefully at levels approaching 60, 70, 80% plus by 2050. Now, sustainable aviation fuels coupled with advanced, highly efficient propulsion systems powered by gas turbines, combined along with improvements in airport infrastructure and operational efficiency, will enable the industry ultimately to meet our commitments to net zero CO2. I'd also like to point out that the aviation industry is becoming more aware of our impact to non-CO2. And SAFs may play a role there as well, as sustainable aviation fuels, at least the ones that we typically refer to, are cleaner burning fuels, may produce lower levels of NVPM or particulate emissions, lower concentrations of sulfates, which are two critical factors, among others, in the formation of contrails, which may impact climate more so than CO2 when measured on shorter timescales. So in a nutshell, at Pratt & Whitney, we're fully in favor of greater production and adoption of sustainable aviation fuels because we view them as absolutely critical for our industry to meet our commitments to net zero by 2050 and to reduce overall environmental impacts within that time frame as well. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Sean. That's very clear, very lucid. Thank you. Sean Newsom from Boeing. Let's hear from you, sir.
Good morning, good afternoon. I think Sean Bradshaw said it really well in terms of the criticality of bringing SAF into aviation. Multiple studies have been done on setting a roadmap for decarbonizing aviation over the past 2 to 3 years. And without exception, every one of them has pointed to sustainable aviation fuel as being the critical component for providing the plurality, if not the majority, of the carbon emission reductions we need by the 2050 timeframe. So for sure, it is absolutely required for us to meet our 2050 ambitions as an industry. In terms of the stock taking of where we're at on sustainable aviation fuels, the topic has clearly become mainstream over the past 2 years or so, 2 to 3 years. I've been working in this space for over a decade, and it has moved from being something within the construct, within the focus of the sustainability organizations of our industry, to being part of the core dialogue within our leadership and with our technical functions as well. Within the airlines, it's moved from being a dialogue within the sustainability teams to being part of the fuels teams. And everybody is now looking at, how do I procure? How do I bring sustainable aviation fuel into my operation today? That's very different than where we are just a couple of years ago. Supplies are currently tight, very limited, but there's a number of production projects on the cusp of reaching the market that is going to change the availability substantially over the next 1 to 3 years. And I'm really optimistic about how things are moving forward at the moment, but yet we still need to do more. We still need to be accelerating the availability of SAF to a much greater degree than what is happening now. And that's going to require a great deal of collaboration across our stakeholders. And I'm looking forward to talking more about that here today.
Thank you, Sean. I know that that mainstream comment is quite an interesting one, and I think a lot of people would agree with you that it needs to become more mainstream. So it's not just a handy acronym; we're actually using it for decarbonisation. Andrea, give us your perspective from BP, please.
Hi, Mark. Thank you very much for having me today, and welcome everyone to the webinar. SAF is very much at the core of BP's strategy for decarbonization. We are a net zero company, and as part of that, we aim to reduce to net zero the emissions of all the products we sell, including products we trade, by 2050. And so this is very much on top of our minds in terms of part of the portfolio of integrated energy solutions we're creating. And SAF is just for us at BP, we look at SAF as a component in the overall energy transition that includes road transport, maritime, and all sectors that we participate in. And we make choices around our assets that take into consideration the energy transition across all sectors. So that's kind of a big deal, because then as part of a bigger solution, SAF can play a big role in the strategy that we're developing overall for BP. In terms of SAF stock taking, Last couple of years, we've seen a lot of good work being developed to define the scope of what we need to do as an industry, defining a roadmap to 2050. And I think what we've seen in the last year is more concrete plans and roadmaps to get to 2030. So this is where we are looking at in the near term. We want to have ambitious goals for 2030, understand what kind of technology, pathways, and feedstocks are available to us, and reach the goals that we have for 2030. So we're moving from strategy into tactical operations and project planning. What we're working on right now is developing technology and feedstock pathways, and it's very important to have clarity in policy making. We've seen a lot of activity in Europe recently, and also some announcements in US as well that give us important information in terms of what it is that we're working on. We're working on all pathways, just to be clear here, and I'm sure there will be more detailed questions here, but it's important to understand that not any one feedstock can deliver the solution for aviation, and we need everything. Other things that are on top of our mind is financing the transition. So what do we need as an investor to see in terms of certainty of demand, and also financing through our own capital and attracting capital from outside to finance these projects. And last but not least, we're also looking at creating the marketplace and the infrastructure needed for SAF. So we know that SAF is a drop-in fuel, but there's all kinds of market mechanisms that are important for this, such as book and claim, and creating blending infrastructure, understanding, working with OEMs to certify multiple fuels, and also working towards 100% SAF certifications. What does that mean in terms of blending and approvals and things like that? So this is just a snapshot of kind of what's on our minds right now, but we're very much in action, and all of these activities reflect real projects, and we have a lot of people working on this at the moment.
Thank you, Andrew, and we'll come on to, I'm sure we'll get some questions. We'll ask you about some of the specifics around those projects. And I do take your points there about more ambitious goals for the nearer term, 2030. 2050 just sounds a little bit like, whoa, I don't know when that is. Also, we do like it that you've got choices around how you deploy your assets, but we'd like you to please prioritise aviation. I'm sure that's something you are very keen on too. So, Stephen from MIT, please give us your contribution, your stock take, sir.
Sure. I come from an academic perspective, and have been doing research on this for over a decade, and so I have a different time frame I'm thinking about. But there are basically three main points I make. The first is that I think at this point in time, we have a good understanding of the environmental and economic costs and benefits of SAF and the role it can play. And I think that's different to, say, 5 years ago, where there were significant uncertainties. Most of those have been resolved. And so at this point in time, we can confidently say that SAF is, it's the right thing to do. There are some remaining technical challenges, but they're mostly very much solvable. And so essentially, it looks like something that you'd say should be scaled up as quickly as possible, and we should just do it. So I think that's sort of environmentally very clear. The second point is that while it's the right thing to do, it seems clear that there needs to be more innovation and advancement in the policy frameworks that can support that, because ultimately industry will need a level playing field with strong and stable policies that can support the widespread deployment of SAF and enable investors to invest the many billions of dollars needed to scale up the industry. So we need this strong and stable policy to be created, at least on a regional scale, if not with some international coordination. And so then the third thing I would say is that, as I mentioned, I think about a different timescale from my perspective. And 2050 might sound like a long time away, but for the aviation industry and even the fuel industry, it's really not very long at all. I mean, the assets we talk about here last for decades, both in aviation and in the energy industry. So we need to think also longer term. And at least the analysis that we've done in work for the FAA suggests that while biomass-derived SAF is going to be a critical part of the solution on 2050 timescale, it's unlikely to be enough, basically because there's not going to be enough you can produce in a sustainable way given the amounts of available land. And secondly, as Sean mentioned, it might get you to 80%, and we need to get to 100% reduction ultimately. So it's the it's a key part of the journey, not the ultimate destination, and we can come back to how that might look later.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, and we'll pick up on those points as we go through. I think all three of those are definitely part of our structure here as we take stock of SAF. Okay, so thank you, everybody. That's a great kickoff, and I think you framed the different discussion points that we're going to cover with some additions too. So let's just check on SAF itself and technically, because Stephen did mention it, kind of, I don't want to be glib about this, but SAF is solved, let's just get on with it and make it, because it's all kind of like we've done it. But let's just check, are there any barriers to the mainstream use of SAF? I mean, not all SAFs are created equal. There are differences. There is the question of older aircraft. We've got to get to 100% usage, certification standards, etc. So technically, what else needs to be done? Perhaps Sean from Boeing, and then Sean from Pratt.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Technically, there are no present barriers to using SAF in greater quantities. The 50% blend limit, the ASTM approval, allows SAF to be used without any additional technical approvals by either the airframe or the engine manufacturers. So that the primary barriers to increasing SAF use today are economic. And the economic challenges, we really believe need a policy enablement in order to overcome those in the short term. Long term, we do want to move the bar up to being 100% SAF compatible. Pratt & Whitney and Boeing have made strong commitments to making that happen, and we're committed to bringing that forward. But that's more of a making sure that we don't have a long-term technical barrier to the growth of SAF use across the industry. It's not a near-term present barrier. I've said for quite a while that when we get to the point that a 50% blend limit is a practical limitation to SAF use, we've made tremendous progress. And I would love to be dealing with that kind of problem rather than getting us from essentially 0.01% of SAF use today. Would love to be dealing with a 50% problem soon.
Sean B from Pratt & Whitney, what's your thought?
I want to agree and amplify Sean Newsom's statements. There isn't a technical barrier with regard to engines and airframes with regard to using 50% SAF. Both Boeing and Pratt have been testing our technology on ASTM approved SAF blends, again, which are Jet A, for a couple of decades. And as technology companies are looking ahead to the future where 100% SAF is certified and available to the industry. I know on the Pratt side, we've tested our motors on near drop-in neat sustainable aviation fuels for quite some time with positive outcomes in each and every single test. So we're going to ensure that we're ready for the future. We're ready for the present, 50% drop-in SAF solutions, and for future state fuels that contain SAF blends up to 100%. We'll be ready to use those fuels as well in our engines and capture the maximum environmental benefit that they bring.
No, absolutely. And Andrea, we were talking a little bit beforehand about the collaboration of industry partners in this area. Did you want to comment about your role in this?
Yes, absolutely. Collaborations are very important to understand the technical capabilities of these fuels, because even though they are drop-in fuels, they're made of different feedstocks, so performance could be better in some parameters and less ideal in others. So we were very keen to working with OEMs to understand how different pathways and feedstocks perform besides just providing energy to the airplane. But also importantly, we were talking about some current barriers around blending and tech approval. So for instance, just something that's the top of my head, we currently cannot blend different pathways, SPK, which is the raw 100% neat SAF. You have to blend it with conventional jet, and then you can put it together in the same tank. So that puts quite a bit of pressure on fuel suppliers, because you have to have a lot of tank storage capabilities to mix all your components. So we have technical teams working on projects and proposals to get different blending scenarios approved so that we can move towards 100% SAF more seamlessly and not have tech barriers around blending and technology, quality checks and things like that. So of course, with safety at the top of mind and ensuring that everything we do is safe and ready to use in aviation.
Great, thank you, Andrew. And I think that answers a question from Jacob Miller, who was asking what technical innovations, if any, are required for engines and systems to achieve 100% SAF use. So hopefully that does address that to some extent. Stephen, did you have any comments on the technical side? You mentioned it in your preamble.
Not beyond that. On the environment side, I can comment.
Okay, thank you. Okay, great. So what I think we'll do now is so, we're not going to dismiss the technical issues, but clearly it's not such a major issue. A lot of the work has been done over years on this. Let's go to the more pertinent topic of actually at the moment, I think we've only got two major, people making, Andrew, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, World Energy and Neste making SAF at volume today. Andrew is going to hit me with if I got that wrong. But let's talk about the barriers to ramping up SAF. Andrew, let's start with you here, because your company has got a massive stake in this transition. What is BP's role here? What's the role in SAF and making it happen?
All right, so I think integrated energy companies have an important role to play because we are used to working with many types of feedstocks and utilizing different refinery kits to make the best out of those feedstocks, as well as integration with existing trade markets and infrastructure to deliver fuels to where they're needed and where they're used. So this is not a race. All participants, including new developers and existing energy providers, have an important role to play here. Where BP makes an impact is we're used to thinking in an integrated portfolio basis and bringing in feedstocks and technology pathways and integrating through existing assets and optimizing existing assets. So that's what we're working on right now. Our biggest topic at the moment is actually feedstock development, and we've announced recently an agreement with New Seed for cover crop feedstock, because currently the two producers that you mentioned, Mark, are using waste oils. And if you look at the chart of how much feedstock is available and can be utilized to produce SAF, it's a small sliver of what we need in aviation. So we're going to need all technology pathways, alcohol to jet, all kinds of biomass technologies, municipal solid waste processing. We're involved in that as well, and we're an investor in a company called Fulcrum that is producing fuel from landfill waste. We're also looking at the future of Efuels because it's very important in Europe. And I've seen a question come in the chat box around energy security. So clearly a deep interest for renewables and deep interest for Efuels. And we're looking at what are the barriers to launch this ideal type of fuel at scale. So basically, every technology and feedstock is in scope. The projects that we have announced, which is 3 standalone projects and 2 biorefinery conversions, are mainly focused on waste oils and where appropriate, vegetable oil feedstocks, renewable or sustainable, like I mentioned, New Seed, but also looking at other technology pathways that need to come in place. So all of that and more. And it's important to get, again, clarity in policy, because Europe and US are diverging a little bit in terms of what kind of feedstocks are preferred. And we would also like to see an international alignment around feedstocks and technology pathways, because right now we just have these 2 centers of interest that have expressed what they're looking to utilize. And of course, we know that IATA has committed to net zero in 2050, and ICAO is meeting this year to agree on how what we're going to do internationally to get there. So we'd like to see more international collaboration and clarity around SAF.
So where does that international alignment need to happen, Andrea? Who are the people that need to align? I know the countries, if you like, or the blocks, but what's the bodies that need to get motoring on that?
Well, we see collective action coming in multiple ways. So policymakers creating demand certainty through incentives, mandates, policies like we're seeing in Europe and US. We're seeing voluntary demand come from all kinds of corporations and individuals that want to make an impact and they have an agenda to reduce emissions. Those are there's less information and data there, right? Certainty around what kind of feedstocks and pathways are needed there, but all of those sources of demand are very important to inform the kind of assets that we invest in. And internationally, many countries are looking at policies that are suitable. I think there's been a lot of good work done in many of the forums that we're all part of. I sit on a number of forums where we kind of share best practices and what we need as a fuel supplier in order to create a reasonable solution. And I think there's just been a lot of work done, but we just need to see more countries kind of clarify how they want to participate in this transition.
Is that the key, Andrea, that sort of country mandate area? Is that the key that's going to help you as a business and also perhaps the investors that you see and talk to actually put their money where their mouth is and get cracking with SAF investment?
Right. It is very important to get good policy because SAF is still very expensive compared to conventional jet, and without commitment around paying the cost difference, it's very hard to justify investment. But I think we've seen a lot of progress in this area, and we're also, again, in these forums that we participate in, talk a lot about how do you finance the transition and what kind of policies are suitable to help the consumers, the ones that pay for fuel, participate in the transition without a huge cost burden. And of course, competitive distortion, which airlines are very concerned with, which is why international collaboration and consistency across policies is going to help everyone.
Who wants to jump in here? Did I see Sean Newsom? Did you? I'm sorry, I can't see if you're putting your hand up, but I think I got the feeling you wanted to jump in.
I must have flinched in some way. I just wanted to add that global harmonization of policy is a long-term objective, but in the near term and the present term, we really want to be partnering with governments on a national basis to help scale up production and availability in the near term in a particular locale. Andrea alluded to the different approaches between the U.S. governments and the European governments. And that is absolutely true. It's been described as that the U.S. approach is all carrots and the European approach is all sticks. And ultimately, we probably need some balance between carrots and sticks in order to move both the supply and the demand in a coherent and aligned fashion. But ultimately, long term, we do, as a global industry, as an industry that operates across borders, we do need that global harmonization, and ultimately we tend to do that type of harmonization through ICAO. But whether SAF being in large part an economic policy is able to be aligned through ICAO is a subject of debate amongst those of us that are active in this space.
Thanks, Sean. And I mean, obviously, Boeing is interesting here because it's actually putting its money where its mouth is on SAF, because you actually got a SAF production investment as well. So congratulations.
Thanks. Yeah, we've made an investment in a SAF production project. We're partnered with a company known as Sky Energy on a project in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. And we've recently also just announced bringing SAF into our company operations for day-to-day flight test activities as of end of last year, beginning of this year. So we really believe that SAF is the key, and we're
But
demonstrating our commitment with our fleet.
how will actually making it help you, Boeing, Sean? What's why really?
Well, we believe that SAF is critical to our industry, and we've been partnering and collaborating on SAF for over a decade. But in order to move the needle faster, we decided we needed to get more involved in the supply chain. What more can we do to help accelerate the availability of supply? And partnering more closely with startup developers such as Sky Energy is something that we've decided to take action on.
No, here, well done, absolutely understood. Stephen, did you want to jump in with a point on this discussion around investors, risk, production?
Yeah, one other aspect I think we can put into the mix here is, I think many of us are acutely aware of energy security right now, and that's long been a concern in the United States. And I think it's an additional way in which SAF adds value, right, is to enable diversification and increase energy security. So I think when putting together the policy frameworks and articulating the benefits, articulating the energy security benefits can be good because they're real, but also it can help to create a bipartisan support for developing SAF and scaling it up, particularly in a US context where there's a range of views over these kind of issues. But with the dual benefits of environment and energy security, bipartisan support is much easier to get, which is of course important for stable long-term policy, which is what we need.
No, absolutely, well said. And we do see, many countries, and Sean mentioned the carrots and the sticks that are being applied or will be applied to encourage not just people to invest, but of course uptake, because it's demand. We don't just want a demand signal, we want actual demand. Then people can actually, knock on the door of BP and Neste and all the rest of Sky and all the rest to actually buy SAF. But mandates are important. The UK is looking at its mandates down in New Zealand, obviously Sweden, Norway, the Netherlands. I'm sure I've missed some others that are looking at actual, the US in a sense is a sort of a pseudo mandate. I just wanted to talk about Australia, Andrea, because there's a lot of collaborations. You've got this collaboration with Qantas. You've probably got it with other airlines as well, but not revealed. But could you update us just, how does that work? And it's not just a piece of paper, an MOU, there's actually a purpose behind it. How are things like that progressing?
Australia is an interesting case study because it's a good example of how an integrated portfolio looks like, right? So we've announced the green hydrogen hub and capabilities to produce fuels from waste oils. And all of these are integrated. So actually, it's kind of interesting when you look at how a refinery operates, because you can always add green hydrogen to an existing operation that utilizes renewable carbon sources from either waste oils or biomass or industrial sources and things like that. And Australia has a lot of industry, a lot of mining. They're interested in using renewable diesel for their fleets. So it makes a lot of sense to have these integrated projects that create green energy, so green electrons for the grid, that we then use to create green hydrogen for utilizing either with existing assets or down the road in the transport sector, and then ultimately in the end potentially SAF down the road. We're not there yet, so I'm not talking. This is just kind of like painting the picture of how this might look. But Qantas has been a very keen partner of us from the very beginning. They're one of the leaders in aviation decarbonization, and this is especially important in Australia. We don't have incentives. We don't have carrots or sticks in Australia, and yet there are a lot of companies there, including Qantas and the mining sector, that are keen to contribute to decarbonization. So, and then we had the asset there that is very well positioned in a country with lots of sunshine and lots of access to different kinds of feedstock. So it made a lot of sense for us to look at Australia as a hub for green energy that services multiple sectors. We're super excited about the potential there, and our teams in Australia are very motivated and working on lots of different opportunities.
Well, good. We'll look forward to those details as they come out. And a country creating a SAF energy infrastructure to either be self-sufficient or maybe even to make it that they can sell it. Wow, there seems to be some sort of sense there, doesn't there? Let's turn a little bit. I mean, because this is a big topic and there's mandates coming this year. We've got the EU, we've got the US, we've got other countries are going to be mandating. They're going to be making legislation around this, which is important. Level playing fields taken as read. But let's move the debate on now. We've got to another area I want to talk about, which is, what comes after or in parallel with SAF? And I mean, I'm talking about e-fuels, I'm talking about hydrogen fuels. And I'm going to ask Sean here, Sean Bradshaw from Pratt, because first of all, for those of us who observe, can you define what an e-fuel is? And is it just a special kind of SAF?
Well, yeah, it's another type of sustainable aviation fuel, Mark. It's a fuel made from green energy generated from solar or wind power or hydropower, which is then used to generate green hydrogen, which is a key feedstock into the synthesis of another type of synthetic fuel called a power to liquid. But I also want to amplify a point Andrea just made, which is that a green hydrogen economy couples in with sustainable aviation fuel production, development and production. Because green H2 is a key feedstock, you've got to invest in a global green hydrogen economy, and a portion of that green H2 generated can be used to source and synthesize PTL for aviation. And that's critical because BDL, or biomass-based sustainable aviation fuels, may only scale up to something like a half of global jet fuel demand by 2050. And according to ATAG's Waypoint 2050 report, they project that PTL production may be needed in order to close the gap to 100% jet fuel demand within a given level of uncertainty. So with regard to hydrogen and SAF, it's really not either or, it's both and. A hydrogen economy couples in with SAF and supports the production of low carbon intensity sustainable aviation fuels. And within the aviation industry, we favor drop-in solutions. And what's really advantageous, the advantages provided by BTL, buy-to-liquid, and PTL, power-to-liquid solutions, is that they're drop-in compatible with existing airframe, aircraft engine technology, as well as the fuel infrastructure, the fuel distribution infrastructure, as well as the infrastructure at airports. In addition, as the industry devises new, more advanced, more highly efficient solutions that are compatible with hydrogen, that enables the industry to use green hydrogen production as it ramps up through the 2040s and through the 2050s as well. So again, SAF and H2, it's really both and, not either or. Both technology solutions are actually coupled.
So let's talk. Yeah, thank you, Sean. Great. I mean, but how far out are we? I mean, I understand what you're saying there, and we can see the criticality of green hydrogen, of renewable electricity to be the sort of the feedstocks, if you like, for this drive. But how far out are we talking about, and how much should we even work on them today if we're really trying to get SAF, the sort of the current feedstock SAFs going? How much should we work on them? Stephen or Sean, do you want to jump in? Or Sean, you start and we'll move on.
Yeah, no, increased SAF production is critical right now in the 2020s, in this decade. That is because the flying fleet has a lifetime of 20-25 years. And in order to have the greatest impact and drive our industry's overall environmental footprint straight down, we need to use and adopt sustainable aviation fuels with low carbon intensity. In the meantime, aviation technology companies such as ours are looking to the future to greener propulsion system solutions. And that would include engines that are compatible with H2, as well as engines that are compatible with BTL and PTL solutions with blends up to 100%.
Stephen, do you want to jump in? I can see you've gone off mute, which suggests to me you want to, sir.
Yes, that's very perceptive of you, Mark. I just wanted to give a kind of a long-term perspective, and I agree with everything as Sean said very well. I think ultimately we need to get to zero life cycle carbons. That means for every carbon atom we put into the atmosphere, we take an equivalent one out. And in the near term, the easiest way to do that is biomass-derived SAF. So you grow a crop through photosynthesis. When you grow that crop, it takes carbon out of the atmosphere, convert the crop into a fuel, burn it, you put carbon back into the atmosphere. That's the right thing to do in the 2020s, as Sean said, and it will get us a long way. It could be up to half. That's sort of a high estimate. Maybe it's sort of a quarter, but something like that of jet fuel demand in the 2050s. But that still leaves a long way to go, right? And we still are left with the requirement that you have to take out a carbon atom and put it back in the atmosphere in a closed loop way. So there's basically two options in the long run. One option, well, let me step back a bit. Well, first is, where does the energy come from? We don't want to use fossil fuel, so that's sort of put aside. The biomass we're going to max out, so that's sort of going to run out. And we should, max it out. And then what's left? Well, we're not going to put nuclear on planes, so essentially all you've got left is electricity, basically. So you've got to make fuel out of electricity somehow. That's the only option left, just by elimination. So that's why we're talking about efuels, power to liquid, or hydrogen, which would still come from electricity. So in the long run, in a sense, Elon Musk was right, planes will be electric, but not really battery electric. It would be more like, power stations providing electricity to create the fuels. The question then is, what kind of fuel? And there's really two big technological bets the industry can make in the long run. The first bet, which is in many ways extremely attractive, is to say we want to use the existing type of airplanes and refueling infrastructure to have a drop-in fuel, in which case the benefit there is we're de-risking on the airplanes, and it's hard to imagine a better fuel than Jet A, Jet A1, and we've been through the periodic table. It pretty much is the best you can get for many reasons. The basic challenge there is that bet means that you're relying on a technology called direct air capture, or DAC, to work, because if you're going to conform to the idea that for every carbon atom you put into the atmosphere, you take one out, that means to create the power to liquid fuel, you need large-scale direct air capture, or DAC, to work in an effective, affordable, and scalable way to create the e-fuels that are needed. So technological bet one is put the risk in the direct air capture. Now, technological bet two would be saying, well, let's not emit carbon in the first place, in which case we don't have to take it out of the atmosphere. And so that technological bet would be on creating a carbon-free fuel like hydrogen, in which case you're putting all your risk in the hydrogen aircraft and the refueling and everything like that. So there's really two big bets you can take. But then we could go back to Sean's point, they're not totally mutually exclusive, because in any event, you have to scale up hydrogen to process the fuels. And maybe they're just things you do on different timescales, where maybe hydrogen sort of more relevant in a slightly longer timescale. And in the near term, we should be scaling up e-fuels, with the first pilot plants coming online now. So that's sort of a sort of 50-year plus perspective on it, I guess.
That's good. Andrea or Sean, I can see you both off mute, which means you're both putting your hand up. Sean first.
Sean was
Andrea?
first. Sean was
Yes.
first. Yes.
So putting it at sort of at a higher level summary, what ultimately we need, or what we need, not ultimately, what we need in the present, in the midterm, and the long term, is fuels that are affordable, sustainable, and available. And we need to take a wide aperture approach to how we to the types of fuels that we want to use within that framework. Absolutely needs to be sustainable. There are a great deal of bio-based feedstocks which have strong sustainability potential. There are a wide degree of studies, a wide degree of opinions as to how much biomass, sustainable biomass, could be available. There are some studies which would suggest that close to 100% of our long-term supply can be provided through waste and residual forms of biomass and sustainable crops in combination. So I think it's important that we not try to leap to the to one solution, one potentially perceived perfect solution in the long term, and dismiss what is available today, because taking action today is of paramount importance. The other thing I want to sort of put on the table here is you could, in a simple terms, you could look at SAF as having two fundamental components: a carbon component and a hydrogen component. And the carbon component can come from either bio-based sources, or it can come from direct air capture. Direct air capture isn't available yet. Biomass is. We want to exploit the sustainable biomass to the maximum extent possible in order to achieve the economics, sustainable and available opportunities. And then on the hydrogen side, as Andrea said, green hydrogen has applicability not just as a fuel itself, not just as a component of a power to liquid or an e-fuel, but as a component in the refining process of a bio-based sustainable fuel as well. So the green hydrogen and the carbon sources are opportunities we can work in parallel while we're bringing pathways that combine the two into scaling up the supply in the short, medium, and long term.
Great, thank you, Sean. Andrea.
I think Sean articulated it perfectly, most of the points that I wanted to make as well. It's important to do a step-by-step approach and do everything we can with what we have today, which is waste oils and landfill waste and alcohol to jet, because these are pathways that are already approved and lots of people and colleagues are working on projects utilizing these types of feedstocks. Green hydrogen can be used today if we can produce it at scale to enhance refinery operations, but also it's synergistic with existing pathways. So for instance, if you have a landfill waste project and you add green hydrogen, you can double the production, because typically you have more carbon in these biomass type projects than you have hydrogen. So green hydrogen can help us transition to an e-fuels future. And yes, we're not ready for direct carbon capture. It is expensive. It's going to require infrastructure, things you have to put on the ground, big ventilators and such to capture air and take the carbon out of there. But the world is emitting today a lot of industrial carbon. And if it makes sense to give it a second life through these types of applications, then we should. So I think it's important to look at what do we need to do in the 2020s, 2030s, and so on. Frankly, at BP, we didn't see e-fuels come this early to market, but it is coming earlier due to policies in Europe. So the industry is really playing catch up to get there. And we have our own modeling that shows what does it take for e-fuels to be economical. We need to see renewable energy costs come down further. We need to see electrolyzer capacity materialize. It's all possible, but it's not here yet. It's just kind of like, yes, it's possible in the future, and would really like to see it. And then there's the whole question of additionality. So governments in Europe are very keen that we do not cannibalize renewable feedstocks and renewable energy from other applications, and that we see new installations that service e-fuels. And we're definitely at BP, we've made a lot of progress with solar and wind application, and it's actually quite exciting to see how fast costs have come down in that space, but it still needs to come further down in order to make e-fuels competitive, even with the other types of SAF that we have available, like HEFA.
Great, thank you. Thank you all of you for bringing us really up to date with e-fuels and the hydrogen, and just really trying to unpick what, to the lay people, and maybe people who are used to messing around with Sean's winglets there and the aviation, an aircraft, to unpick this piece of the energy puzzle. Fascinating stuff. We're going to talk a little bit just before we go on to the final Q's and A's on this non-CO2 impact. I'm going to ask Stephen to introduce this, because contrails, they're just beautiful, aren't they? Oh dear, they're not so clever, are they? You're on mute, Stephen. That's it. Well done.
Yeah, I would agree. They are beautiful, but the current understanding of contrails is they cause roughly as much warming as all of the CO2 from aviation. So it makes our industry have a bigger challenge than most other industries, in that it's roughly 2x the baseline from the fuel. So that's sort of the challenging side of the equation. There is, however, some good news, which is that there's been a lot of research done, which is now ramping up to even trials now, that suggests that by making small rerouting of airplanes, you can avoid the parts of the atmosphere where contrails form. And for example, we just published at MIT some work using real-time satellite observations to observe contrails forming, and technologies like that can be used to enable rerouting of airplanes. So we think that, and it will take some time to prove this out in trials, but we think that you can basically halve aviation's warming in exchange for a 1 or 2% increase in fuel burn. And that could potentially be the fastest and cheapest way to make some rapid progress as we scale up SAF, which is the other key component. So as to simplify things, basically the climate impact is roughly half CO2, roughly half contrails. If we can take out the contrails part with some operational measures that are relatively cheap, that makes a huge amount of progress. And then the CO2 part we deal with essentially with SAF over the next couple of decades, and beyond that, something that relies on on power generation, probably e-fuels and then possibly hydrogen too.
Sean from Boeing, Contrails, what's your thought?
Yeah, so just to add on to what Stephen said, I think one of the key points we want to get across is that the solution space for contrail and non-CO2 portions of emissions is different or perhaps wider than the CO2 emissions reduction space. So there's been a number of studies that have demonstrated that SAF biofuels can reduce the creation and or persistence of contrails due to the lower particulate matter and smoke emissions that are precursors to contrail formation and persistence. The engine companies continue to innovate on their combustor designs, which can also reduce the particulate matter and the soot emissions, which can also reduce the contrail formation and persistence over time. So those are both positive aspects that are independent of the CO2 emissions profile, the direct CO2 emissions profile, in addition to what Stephen was saying about the contrail avoidance routings that are being studied today. And then it's also to keep in mind that there is a relatively high level of scientific uncertainty in the size of the contribution that these non-CO2 effects have to global warming relative to the CO2 emissions. The CO2 emissions the scientific uncertainty is very, very low. We have a good understanding what that is, both in terms of its contribution to global warming and how much it contributes in any given flight. With contrail formation, our ability to predict whether a contrail will form or persist on any given flight is itself uncertain. And that's one of the challenges that needs to be worked out before the contrail avoidance routings can really take hold and be a real benefit. So work to come on that, but definitely optimistic that there are a number of solutions available to us.
Yes, thank you, Sean. Stephen, then perhaps Sean B. Did you want to say something? But Stephen first.
Yeah, I think I agree mostly with what Sean said. I think one thing I would say is that, well, in particular, because I agree with the point he made that it's very hard to predict where contrails will form. That's why I think to a large extent, the best approach we have is based on observation. So we have real-time satellites now, high resolution, and techniques have been developed to track where contrails form in real time. So to a large extent, it looks like thanks to these new satellites that have been launched in the last couple of years, combined with the computational technology to process the images, I think we can get around those problems that were probably showstoppers even 5 years ago. So I think that situation is very rapidly changing, and I think observations, that's real, right? On the scientific uncertainty, I agree. I mean, it's definitely the case that the uncertainty in contrail warming is much higher than CO2. I'm not saying Sean suggested this, but just to make sure that people don't take this perception. I don't think when something's uncertain, you draw the conclusion you shouldn't do something. If anything, you could say, well, it could be much higher than the central estimate, right? So it's still a reason to do something, but it's also a reason to try and figure it out better if you can.
Sean Bradshaw, did you want to jump in for a second?
Yeah, if I'm going to add to Sean and Stephen's statements. I think this is why it's critical that there's a partnership, evolving partnerships between government, industry, and academia to better understand and to capture the causal factors between aviation engine emissions, the inputs to contrail, linear contrail formation and the formation of contrail cirrus clouds, and ultimately radiative forcing. The end result of that will be the generation of heuristics, engineering tools, know-how, empirical data that will help companies like Boeing and help companies like Pratt avoid and reduce the impact of non-CO2 emissions, including contrails, on the environment. So this is an area I think rich for scientific research and technology development. And it's something that we should all keep our eye on.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I'm just going to move to a couple of, so thank you. And I think it's very important to bring the non-CO2 impact of aviation higher up the agenda, because even if it does seem to some a bit sort of bit opaque, it's, as Stephen's perhaps said, it's not a reason to not take it seriously and figure it out, etc., which I think we're all agreed on there. Just a couple of questions coming in from the floor. Perhaps this is one for you, Andrea. I don't know. Is this what's expected from airports in terms of infrastructure to respond to SAF demand volume? Just briefly.
SAF is a drop-in fuel, so we don't see airports having to do anything different than they do today. We do see a lot of interest from airports to get SAF because it is it's a way to attract actually airlines to come and visit. But we do have to be realistic that in a transition phase with how small the volumes are today, it's very difficult to get drops of SAF in every airport that wants to have some. So I think we're just looking at a step-by-step approach where the big airports that are close to production facilities are getting the most of the fuel, and also the airports that are in incentivized or mandate markets are going to get most of the fuel in the beginning, and eventually we do see all the airports get some SAF.
Thank you, Andrea. Got a question from Peter Gordon. He says, kind of, I think it says, which is easier, creating SAF that's Jet A1 drop-in, I guess, so you don't need to change engines or airport refueling, or going to a new technology, changing engines and ground facilities to cope with a fuel that might be easier to produce but requires modifications down the line. Sean B or Sean N, did you want to sort of take that one? I think it's a sort of a drop-in versus new exotic fuel, exotic like hydrogen type like argument. One of you's got to take it. Thank you, Sean.
Well, I think from our perspective, a drop-in solution, a drop-in sustainable aviation fuels is the best solution in the near and medium term, and perhaps the long term for short, medium, and long haul flights, which will be powered by highly efficient gas turbine engines far into the future. Hydrogen requires research and development, technical challenges that can be overcome, but upfront, they are challenges. So the answer is clear, certainly in the medium and long term, and even in particular for flights longer than 1,500 kilometers.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sean. Sean N, did you want to add, or is that, are you quite happy with that?
Quite happy. I'll just add that in terms of the creation of drop-in versus non-drop-in fuels, it's not so much the relative difficulty of producing one or the other. The advantage of the drop-in fuels is as Sean said, the infrastructure, both the airplanes and the fuel distribution, the energy distribution infrastructure. And that's the heavy driver of why that makes so much sense for the industry.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, gentlemen. Now, we've got a question from Peter Beer at the Austrian Cockpit Association. Thank you, Peter, for the question. And I think it's in a presentation by the Austrian Environmental Agency, creating SAF requires enormous amounts of energy, and only 8% goes into the, actually propelling the aircraft. Is that green? How does this fit into your world of green energy? If I understand the question right, who wants to have a go at that? But Stephen, what do you think? Are we just spending a lot of energy to create SAF, and actually we're not actually? Is it really green?
I think in a sense I would put it to the questioner that it's not quite the right question, right? The right question is how do you reduce carbon emissions? And when you frame it that way, then SAF does make sense, because you're taking carbon out of the atmosphere and reusing it. And you can frame questions around things like XG analysis and all these sorts of things, and some people used to look at concepts like energy return on investment, but really that's not not meaningful in terms of what we're trying to achieve. We want zero CO2 and low cost, right? Those are the metrics that really matter, and when you view it through those metrics, SAF does look good in the medium term.
And if the fuel production infrastructure operates on green energy or low carbon.
So just repeat that again, Sean, sorry.
Well, if the fuel infrastructure itself operates on low carbon intensity energy sources, that yields a green fuel, right? And over time, that's the expectation.
Right, right. Excellent. Thank you. Well, look, everybody, we've had an hour of this, and I hope that the audience has appreciated and got some greater understanding of taking stock of SAF as we have today on the 10th of March 2022. So I hope that in terms of aviation sustainability journey, we've learnt a lot. I certainly have. I hope the audience has appreciated, and I know it will have done, your inputs, everybody. You know, we've got a long journey ahead of us to make aviation truly sustainable. And, you know, hopefully this kind of discussion takes us a little bit forward just in terms of our understanding and our collaboration, etc. So thank you to everybody for your contributions. Thank you to the audience for your questions, and to Pratt & Whitney for partnering us on this webinar. It will be available on demand next week. Our next sustainability webinar is on the 9th of June, I'm told, and I am hoping to be moderating that one as well. Thank you so much to Sean Bradshaw, to Sean Newsom from Boeing, to Stephen Barrett from MIT. Really great to have you on. Andrea, of course, from BP. Thank you for getting up so early, those of you who've been in the far west time zone of the US. Getting lots of thank yous coming in from the audience, which we can see them popping up. So thank you, everybody. It's 1 minute past 4, so I'm going to wish you all a very good day and a very good evening, morning, afternoon. Thank you to all of our panelists. Round of applause, as it were, virtual. Thank you to everybody. Thank you, and see you next time. Goodbye.